Thank you very much for having me. This is joint work with Ben Pugsley, who's an expert on firm dynamics, Hamin Qin, who is an expert on computation, and Kaspar Zimmermann, who's an expert on history. So next year, 2026, is the 250th anniversary of the Wealth of Nations. And people at Chicago have a habit of trying to think about how is our world different from the world of Adam Smith. And if you go back to this founding document of economics, Smith envisioned a world that is filled with small producers. It's completely decentralized, kind of atomistic capitalism. And today when we wake up, at least our world is very different along one dimension, which is this is a world dominated by giant companies that have tremendous influence on economic activities. For example, in the US nowadays, the largest 1,000 companies by sales, if you add up their sales, it's about 50% of US gross output. So then given their tremendous influence on economic activities, it's natural to be curious about where these largest firms come from, what are their life stories, what are the patterns of their formation, and is their dominance persistent? Interestingly, our understanding along this dimension is still fairly limited. In many of the firm dynamic models that we work with, we have a very simplified framework where firms face idiosyncratic shocks, and the largest ones are just the lucky ones that accumulate good idiosyncratic shocks. And firm age distribution is stationary. The top firms are displaced all the time. Whether that's true in the data or what are the patterns in the data, we actually don't know that much about what has been happening. Sometimes people infer from the profile of large firms something that might be happening in the economy. I'm personally a huge fan of the Draghi report on European competitiveness. Maybe some of you contributed to this work or wrote the quote that I'm using. But do we know if this is true? Should we look at the age profile of large firms to infer something about what is happening in the economy? So in this paper, we collect new data to understand the life stories of the largest US companies throughout the past century and how they've evolved and the ebbs and flows of the top companies and the stories and mechanisms behind them. We also then supplement this with some European data that you'll see later. And we find the following empirical facts. First, if you look at sectors like industrials, which is predominantly manufacturing with a little bit of mining, it turns out that the emergence of the largest firms is super uneven over time. It's not that we get prospective superstars born every year, every decade. It turns out that if you look at today's largest US manufacturers, they were born at the turn of the 20th century. If you look at the largest US manufacturers 50 years ago, 100 years ago, they were all from that generation, the generation that was born around the turn of the 20th century. So that generation has been very influential for more than a century, and we call that the special generation. And at the same time, the individual top companies actually have changed quite a bit. I will show the details later. That's not always and universally true. In a sector like retail and wholesale, it turns out that there's no special generation. The top firms emerge all the time, and age distribution looks fairly stationary. And today and in the past, the largest retailers and wholesalers are roughly always about 60 years old. Now, services, there were very few large services companies before 70s and 80s. Today, there are more, and they look quite young. They look actually very much like the largest industrials at the beginning of the 20th century. Whether there will be a special generation, it's too early to tell. We will have to look back on this 50 years later. So overall, when you put together the collection of evidence we see in the US, it turns out that there are some settings that produce top firms, where especially generations of top firms that end up being dominant for decades to come. And so then going back to the Draghi report, it's true if Europe wants to have top companies in the domain of services, it could very well be that if you miss the boat now, then you'll miss the boat almost forever. We'll come back to this. But then why is that the case? Why do we see such persistent special generation, especially in manufacturing and potentially in services, not so much in retail wholesale? We will do extensive investigation of firm dynamics models later on to understand the driving forces. Long story short, to our best understanding, this type of special generation is very likely the symptom of firm dynamics in the aftermath of industrial revolution. So now if we have an industrial revolution in the services sector, maybe we will repeat that story, but we'll have to see. So the foundation of this work is pretty extensive data collection on the identities of the largest American companies over time. Nowadays, you can go to Fortune magazine and get such lists. Back in the days, we used Fortune magazines going back to 1955, and then before that, there was a snapshot of the largest American companies in 1917 compiled by historians. And once we have these lists, we then go on to research the origins of these companies. Today, if you go on the Fortune 500 and so on company websites, you easily find their own narrative of their story. They were founded in year X to do Y. So that's reasonably straightforward and definitive. Earlier on, especially for the largest firms in early 20th century, we need to go through business history sources. We've done a lot of due diligence to make sure that these our dating is accurate. You can cross-check with sporadic dating that others have done. Unfortunately, in US Census data, for example, they don't know the firm age for those founded before 1976. But if you look at very broad age groups, what we find and the broad course picture in census align pretty well. Happy to talk about the details if you're interested. And we're also very happy to share the data. So what do we see? Standing from today, if you look at today's Fortune 1000 companies, and as I said, these companies account for half of US gross output, so they're tremendously important. There are some sectors that are not so represented among top firms, and we don't pay too much attention to them, like construction. And then there are some sectors that are so regulated, it's too complex, like utilities, so they're not the focus. In industrials, which is predominantly manufacturing plus a little bit mining, you see the largest cohort among top US industrial firms are those from the 1900s. So my x-axis is the founding decade of the firms, and the y-axis is how many of firms were founded in each decade. So industrial has this big hump around the turn of the 20th century. Services, the hump is around 1970s and 1980s. Trade, which is retail wholesale, the hump is around 1970s and 80s as well. So we first dig deeper into industrials. People have, if you look around at the largest US manufacturers like Pfizer and Boeing and so on, yes, they are old, but they used to be young. So if you look at the largest US manufacturers in 1955 and do the same exercise, it turns out that, again, 50 years ago, the largest US manufacturers were also those from the turn of the 20th century. And if you lived in 1955 and tried to imagine the world, and if you adopt the stationary conjecture, then you would imagine that by now, the birth year distribution of large firms is going to be the dashed line. You just move forward by 60 years. But in the end, we don't. The birth year distribution looks much more similar in calendar time than in terms of stationary age distribution. And even more strikingly, if you look at the largest US manufacturers in 1917, they were still the generation from the turn of the 20th century, which means at the time they were exceptionally young. So their average age at that time was about 30 years old, became 60 years old in mid-20th century, and now about 100 years old. There's the aging of the top firms. But they're not the same companies. This is one way to try to convey to you how the individual companies have changed. So the dark blue line is still the birth year distribution of the largest industrials now, and then the lighter blue lines are the subset of them that were also the largest in 1955, which is about 30%. And then the gap means what we call late bloomers firms that were not the largest in 1955, but are the largest now, yet they're still old, like Pepsi, Clorox. You can actually name quite a few of them, which had fortunes turned in favor of them later on. And then you can also name many of them that used to be large and then disappeared, for example, Swift and Armour and Borden and so on and so forth. We give many such examples, which is true not just for manufacturing as a whole, but also for subsegments of manufacturing. Now, when you look at other countries, we have less data, but some data from Germany and the UK. Long story short, Germany is actually very much like the US in this domain, that the largest German firms were systematically those from the turn of the 20th century. UK actually not so much. UK's large manufacturers have relatively stationary firm age distribution. There's no generation that persisted. Why? Well, Chandler, a very famous economic historian from Harvard Business School, speculated when he was writing in the 1990s that the German firms during the Second Industrial Revolution took advantage of new technologies, built lasting enterprises, and UK firms were lagging behind. They were insisted on family management and so on and so forth. We'll come back to this investigation in a few slides. Now, outside of manufacturing, in retail wholesale, as I said, firm age distribution is actually stationary. You used to have the department stores, and then the drug stores, and then the discount retailers. So the generations actually move on instead of in manufacturing where some generations stay. So that's the data in a snapshot. And services we don't know, we see some resemblance of the largest manufacturers in the early 20th century, and we will wait to see if they form a special generation going forward. So why might this be the case? And also that will inform our understanding of what might happen to services, and also is Draghi right to say that Europe is in some trouble for not having young large firms in the services sector. We start with benchmark firm dynamics models just to fix ideas, and we embellish it with more elements to see what can generate, for example, special generation. Some of you are probably very familiar with the Hoppenheim models. Some people may not work in this space, but the idea is very simple. You have firms that have productivity. One element of productivity is permanent, which is in red, and then there are shocks to productivity. And if you start with this simple type of firm dynamics model, you will get that the overall age distribution is going to be skewed towards young firms, not surprisingly. Among the largest ones, you will get a hump, which is the natural hump that the young firms haven't had enough time to grow, and the old firms have more time to die. So you will have middle-aged firms most represented among the large ones. That also means you can't just look at firm age distribution at a given point in time and say if it's special or not. The reason that we can say definitively special generation exists in manufacturing is because we can see them through many different cross-sections over time. So then how do we depart from this stationary world and embed elements that can generate special generation? We've done explorations along 3 dimensions. These are the 3 most common conjectures. If you have further conjectures, we're happy to consider and work on them as well. So the first narrative, again, I will attribute to Chandler, is this view of the long aftermath of Industrial Revolution. During the Second Industrial Revolution, scalable technology came around, and especially entrants were well positioned to adopt them because the incumbents were rigid and they fell behind. So entrants adopted these technologies with some very mild degree of first mover advantage. This cohort can actually persist for quite some time. The second hypothesis, which is also very common, is that manufacturing maybe was growing very rapidly in the early 20th century, and then it declined, so there are fewer entrants now than before, and the large number of entrants maybe from the early 20th century was the reason for the special generation. We also pay tribute to that hypothesis. The third one is maybe regulation has somehow shifted that made entry harder. Later on, we will investigate that as well. So for the Chandlerian hypothesis, the main modification that we do is to make production technology heterogeneous. Instead of having only the traditional production technology, which is what you see without the K term, we say there's another modern production technology that's more scalable, that has the K term. And firms, when they enter, they choose the production technology to operate with, except that this modern technology has an adoption cost, so you don't get it for free. The traditional one, you can just use it for free, modulo the fixed entry cost for everybody. And then we have a reduced form representation of first mover advantages, which is learning by doing, which is productivity grows with age, you build organizational capital, et cetera. So in this very simple world, we do an experimentation where during the second industrial revolution, the adoption cost of the modern technology declines over time. And we see what happens if this occurs. And we date the second industrial revolution following, for example, Gordon, which is 1860 to 1900. And so there's a pretty elaborate calibration. It's not an easy calibration because we're dealing with a moving target. The firm size distribution, the firm age distribution is not stationary yet. Everything is moving, and you can see the paper for more details of how we address that. After overcoming these computational hurdles, we can show that if we match a combination of moments that govern the more usual firm dynamics, like entry rate, exit rates in normal times, together with the age of top firms over time, the fraction of them that come from the early 1900s, we can actually have a model that matches moments very well and also produce these patterns that are not targeted. And these patterns are the age distribution of top firms in manufacturing over time, as well as how much of the top firms today were also top firms in the 1950s. So Chandler does pretty well in matching these facts. The other two hypotheses, less so. Well, there's some elaboration about how Chandler succeeds, which I will skip a little bit in the interest of time. The combination of the new technology, which differentiates this cohort from firms that came in before, and learning, or very mild first mover advantage, which differentiates from potential entrants after, that combination turns out to work well. For the hypothesis that manufacturing was growing in the past and then it started to decline, this actually is not so easy to match the data, in part because if you look at US manufacturing growth, there's nothing super different from 1880 to like 1920, which is the decades of our special generation. Manufacturing growth was pretty high until 1960s in the US. So if we have to live with that and maintain the fact that manufacturing was growing quickly for a century, then it's just very hard to generate patterns that you see in the data, which is very concentrated birth of these prospective superstars within the window of roughly only 40 years. It turns out if you respect the fact that manufacturing has been growing quickly until the 1960s, then today you would expect the most represented cohort among large firms are the ones immediately before the end of high manufacturing growth. Now, finally, we also investigate things like time-varying entry costs. What is this? Well, this is a response to the conjecture that maybe US regulation has changed somehow, entry became more difficult. By and large, the challenge with this hypothesis is if you just think that regulation has become more difficult, entry has become more difficult, it doesn't explain the emergence of the special generation, why they suddenly emerged in the 1880s, what differentiated them from the firms that came before. And you need like pretty elaborate tricks to push that generation onto the scene, and then that messes up many other things that I won't have time to elaborate. So that's the story of industrials, at least to our best understanding. What we see is long echoes of the second industrial revolution, which may then transport to services if services also have the feature of these new technologies coming into the scene, and even very mild first mover advantage is going to do it. I forgot to mention that this story can also match the fact that the top firms, the individual top firms, change all the time. That's just the magic of idiosyncratic productivity shocks. If you use idiosyncratic productivity shocks that match census moments and so on and so forth, it turns out that they're actually enough to produce quite a bit of shuffling among the top firms, even as the generation persists. So then finally, what's different in retail and wholesale? Why don't they have special generation? It could be lack of technological revolution. It could be lack of any first mover advantage. So we did some diligence to see what might be going on. Technological revolution is very difficult to directly prove or disprove, but we can see in the data that it seems first mover advantage where any intrinsic buildup of organizational capital seems fairly weak in retail. It could be, Ben likes to say retail is an open book. You can see how other retailers operate. You can copy and imitate much more easily. And the reason that we say that is if you have non-zero accumulation of organizational capital, then the largest retailers would be too old compared to the data. If you also want to match all the other moments about entry-exit rates and the entrance size distribution and so on and so forth in retail and wholesale, we already see that the entrant size distribution in retail wholesale is skewed enough that without any accumulation of organizational capital, we would expect the top firms to be about 60 years old, which is what we see in the data. If you then give them even a very mild amount of accumulation of organizational capital, then the top firms just don't die out enough and they will be too old. So that's our current best understanding of how these different sectors fit together. So there are sector-specific characteristics that also matter how you interpret the landscape of the top firms. So overall, through pretty extensive data collection and extensive investigation of the stories behind them, we see that in some settings, you have these special cohorts which have advantages relative to firms that came before and relative to firms that come after. If for potential entrepreneurs like our MBA students, they have to face the reality that it's not that always equally easy to build one of the giant enterprises that will last. And there are special opportunities, times of major industrial revolution, of technological disruption that are particularly conducive to the emergence of these top firms. Will such a special generation occur in services? The conditions, based on our understanding of the model, is the combination of new technologies that expand returns to scale, which is likely in services, and adoption particularly conducive to entrance, which may also be likely in services. The services have new business models in many ways, and very, very mild organizational capital accumulation is enough. And the combination of these factors is going to produce hysteresis. So then if I were to speculate Draghi's diagnosis of the fact that Europe doesn't have young top services firms, if they still don't emerge for the next 20 years or 30 years, it could very well be that it's just going to be very difficult to penetrate once this wave of industrial revolution passes. And whether Europe wants to have those large firms or not, if you do, then now is the time, and you need to think about how they might emerge and what are the things that will facilitate their growth and emergence. And it can happen very quickly. It can happen within a span of 20, 30 years, like what we saw in early 20th century of the largest US manufacturers that came into the scene within a span of 20, 30 years. And I look forward also to learning more from the panel. But before that, I look forward to learning more from my discussant. Thank you very much.
So now we have Marta Morazzoni from UCL. You have 10 minutes.
Yes. Thanks a lot. So first of all, I want to thank the organizers for putting together such an amazing program and inviting me to discuss an amazing paper by Yueran and her co-authors. So this is a paper about superstar firms through the generations. So of course, a very timely topic and as already said, very policy relevant. So just a summary of the paper, the way I perceived it, the way I read it. The research question or questions that this paper tries and succeeds in answering is whether there are some generations of firms that are actually special and what can give rise to such special generations of firms. The paper tackles these research questions in two ways. One is more like empirical, and then there's a very carefully crafted model and quantitative framework. So on the empirical side, they go above and beyond what I thought it was possible in terms of documenting in the data that top manufacturing firms in the 1910s, in the 1950s, and even today, predominantly date back to some decades at the beginning of the last century, end of the 19th century. And this special generation is indeed staying over time, even if turnover among top firms is substantial. And then they also document how the experience of industrial firm might be compared and might be different from firms in sectors such as services and trade. The quantitative framework brings about a novel model of firm dynamics in which adoption of a scalable technology and first mover advantage through learning by doing can indeed rationalize the experience of industrials firms at the beginning of the last century and why they are still relevant nowadays. So the key results are also that time-varying market size growth rates, so an alternative explanation for this advantage, this special generation, or entry cost could not produce this special generation that we do see in the data. Among retailers and wholesalers, learning seems to be weak, so this process of learning by doing might not be present, and perhaps this is why a special generation is harder to sustain and then quite standard in the literature of firm dynamics. Idiosyncratic productivity shocks can still explain much of the turnover that we do see in the data. So the point of the paper in just one sentence is that lasting non-stationarity among top firms can stem from sudden waves of technological change. So I have comments, or rather questions rather than comments, because the paper is done, the paper is finished, and so carefully crafted. So perhaps these are my questions for future papers by Yueran and her co-authors. So I do see why the firm distribution clearly is non-stationary in manufacturing among industrial firms. But if one looks at the number of firms for services, there seems indeed to be a special cohort born in 1950s and through 1980s. Even looking at employment or sales in terms of metrics, we do see that even for trade, there seems to be a special cohort. And I do find interesting, they document in the paper that 50% of retailers and wholesalers indeed persist from 1955 to 2018. It's true that the resulting firm distribution doesn't seem to deviate so much from non-stationarity, but I have maybe a question of whether maybe a next census or a next fortune list could actually find evidence of non-stationarity there. So there is a clear cohort effect, but perhaps throughout the board in different sectors, we can also see instances of declining business dynamism. And yes, the paper documents turnover is present even for top industrials, yet once domestic or foreign acquisitions are accounted for, I was surprised to see that 60% of firms persist from one list to the next one. So I think that this, of course, diverts a bit from the current scope of the paper, but Maybe for a future paper, it would be interesting to connect multiple literatures, investigate non-stationarity perhaps arising in other sectors. And what I mean by multiple literatures is perhaps looking at this decline in business dynamics, this increase in mergers and acquisitions, and how this could further contribute to slower dynamism in the economy. A small digression that I found quite interesting is why there was no special generation of industrials in the UK, but yes, in Germany. I understand that through the lens of this model, it's because they could not adopt technology or they could not learn as much. I was also perhaps thinking that there could be further explanations that could differentiate the experience of the UK, US, and Germany, and these come from my comments on the quantitative framework. So the questions that I have on the model and the quantitative exercise, first of all, from a very perhaps boring point of view, I think it could be interesting to maybe explore further the role of ex-ante firm heterogeneity. So you said we're looking forward to other type of explanations that we could test, and maybe this is one that I was thinking when reading the paper, because what distinguishes firms at start in your model is their own fixed effect, let's say, and the initial draw of this time-varying productivity. So my question was, could a temporary change of these two produce a special generation, and how could we interpret the special generation of industrials through a temporary change of these two? So my question is perhaps would a high draw of permanent fixed effect be akin or make the adoption of a scalable technology easier for a generation? Would a high draw of initial productivity plus a properly calibrated productivity process be akin to learning? These were questions that I was having when reading the paper. And then perhaps going more into let's say, future papers, perhaps it could be interesting to explore the potential role of increasing returns to scale over time. So there's a growing literature in firm dynamics, in macro, in IO, documenting rising returns to scale. And so again, my question is, could higher fixed costs or higher returns to scale explain the aging of industrials despite their turnover? And this is just a boring comment on the details of the calibration. So just concluding, overall, I think this is a very timely paper. It's an incredible research effort, really at the frontier. And the paper is ready for the submission. There was very little that I could comment. Thoughts for the, again, future projects perhaps. This paper shows that incumbents pre-second industrial revolution could not adopt as easily the new technology. And the learning also motivates why this cohort of entrants at the turn of the last century was so successful. My question is this the last big technological innovation wave? And you seem to suggest that specifically in other sectors, we might be observing a new technological wave. And so how can we, for instance, in Europe, take advantage of that? Did successive incumbents compared to the second industrial revolution become good at incorporating technologies or at learning? So didn't we see a new generation, for instance, in industrials emerging because the shocks ever after were not as big, or was it because incumbents as well became more able to incorporate new technologies and learning? And in times of slower growth and slower business dynamism, what's in for policy? You addressed already this question in the last couple of minutes of your presentation, and I think it's very interesting. So perhaps a future paper would be trying to use this quantitative framework to understand what's in there for policy for this continent as well as for the US. Thanks a lot.
Thank you, Marta. Maybe you take a couple of minutes and then we open up. Yeah.
Just one thing.
Yeah.
Thank you so much. It's super helpful. I just want to comment a little bit on declining dynamism, which I imagine many people are interested in and might have wanted to ask. So it didn't make into this draft, but if you actually, because we already had a lot of material, but if you compare, for example, largest firms in 1955 and then take now, and then take a midpoint, like say 1985 and 1990, actually the turnover among top firms is greater between 1990 and now than between 1955 to 1990. Wow. So the dynamism at the top doesn't seem to decline. And then there are McKinsey quotes that say, oh, S&P 500 firms used to be there for like many decades, and now they're only there on average 15 years, something like that, which is very difficult to substantiate, but it's actually true that top firm dynamics didn't decline over time as far as we can tell. I think there are probably different drivers of the dynamism at the top than general dynamism in the economy, which is also interesting and has been studied extensively. At the top, as you said, what are the technologies that require incumbents versus entrants to implement, and so on and so forth. That's what I'm working on now. Acquisition, that's a smaller point. A lot of the acquisitions happened when the target was failing, like Union Carbon and Carbide, Republic Steel, and so on and so forth. So it's a little bit tricky to say if you survived through your acquire, actually, whether you are still dominant. And many of them were almost disasters. That's it. Happy to take questions from the audience.
Questions? So let me, yes.
Hello, it's Paola Di Casola from the ECB. Thanks a lot for the presentation and discussion. It's very interesting. I was wondering if you had thought about the issue with the financing, so the differences between the industrial sector and these differences you find with the retailers, whether it's about the type of financing that these firms have to need and the way they need to set up their connection with the banks or other investors. They make the incumbents having hard time and being successful in one sector or related to the other one.
Do we collect more?
That's, yes.
Hi, very nice paper and discussion. I guess I'm wondering how you think about whether this scalable technology can actually come up from the special generation as one of the outputs that creates these companies, that are so special and that turns out to be scalable, that could have an impact on the dynamism at the top that you were referring, because in a way of like self-fulfilling, this firm is developing a scalable technology that's going to allow them to be special and grow and survive longer.
Okay, Rafaela, you want to?
Two comments, one measurement and one conceptual. From the measurement side, I see that it's interesting to do in the industry, services, and wholesale retail. But one aspect of US firms in particular is the fact that they've grown tremendously across boundaries of manufacturing. And so Teresa Fort has these beautiful papers using the census showing this bleeding into services of manufacturing. So I'm wondering whether maybe that classification may be misleading, because one of the things that characterizes these firms is exactly how far they go in terms of scope. And conceptually, the lack of learning, could that be that actually the technologies are evolving so quickly that it's hard for any one company to capitalize on one vintage of technology, just because there are, in those sectors where you don't find evidence of learning by being dominating, maybe it's the cycle of technological change that is faster.
Okay, great. So for the financing question, that's very interesting based on, it's not easy to find concrete data on this, but it seems that in general, manufacturing has depended more on external financing than services, even though early on, like Rockefeller's time, they were mostly doing internal financing. Now they rely more on external financing, but like retail wholesale is still more dependent on internal financing. But I think that's more of an outcome of the underlying technological feature that in manufacturing you have much more scalability. That's why they needed external financing. Happy to think more about this, but at least on the spot, I don't think there are intrinsic reasons for access to financing to differ across these industries, especially in a country like the US. But there are reasons that they ended up using financing differently because of technological features. For whether it's self-fulfilling, you reminded me of John Sutton's indulgence and cost type of arguments. We have a lot of representation from LSE London. It could be, but I think, maybe a bit speculative. Some of the technology is, to a large extent, exogenous. We are taking it as exogenous. But yes, people develop technologies for a reason, but then technologies at some point, like AI, we pursue that for a reason, but then at some point, because of luck and so on and so forth, there are breakthroughs, and then they have implications for firm dynamics, for who is best at implementing them. For the question about industry composition, we did very elaborate coding of the industry at the beginning and the industry now. Actually quite surprising to me, if you take their current industry code and compare with the industry that best described their business at the beginning, which is much easier because they were doing one thing at the beginning. The overlap is 80 to 90%. So the current industry code, I mean, just from CompuStat or SEC registration, the industry that describes their main business, which is the one most represented by sales. So migration actually along some dimension happens, but to completely different field actually is very rare. And in fact, you actually see this also in the decline of companies like American Can, Continental Can. When they were declining, they tried to do other things like financial services. It was a disaster. American Express is, I think, the most extreme outlier of going from express mail to financial services, but those are extremely rare. So Teresa Ford's paper, if I remember correctly, was saying that manufacturing firms do more and more services. Right? And we are being conservative, actually. I think IBM and Intel and so on are still being classified as manufacturing. And despite that, the special generation from early 20th century in manufacturing survives, even though Apple might even be in the data set, be classified as manufacturing just because of their SEC registration. So it's despite of that.
Or maybe because of that, right?
Well, if they were classified, so these younger manufacturers like NVIDIA or Apple, they're still tagged as manufacturing instead of services. And despite these few recent successes that are straddled between manufacturing and services, the entire manufacturing landscape is still dominated by the old firms. But they will be washed out at one point, according to our model, in 500 years for sure. They will disappear.
So thank you very much. Fantastic. I would like to thank you all for presenting and discussing. Please, super big round of applause. And